The road leading to the manor was shrouded in a heavy, almost unnatural mist that seemed to cling to the trees and the uneven cobblestones like a living presence. The traveler moved cautiously, the crunch of their boots on the gravel sounding unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed hesitant, carrying only whispers that seemed almost human, as though the forest itself was aware of the secrets lying ahead. The manor rose in the distance, its dark silhouette cutting sharply against the grey sky. The towers and gables loomed like watchful sentinels, and the windows, dark and reflective, seemed almost like eyes observing every hesitant step. The air carried a scent of damp earth and decayed wood, mingling with something indefinably metallic, an olfactory hint that death and history were deeply intertwined within these walls. As the traveler drew closer, the manor's intricate architecture revealed details that hinted at both grandeur and decay. Stone gargoyles perched along the edges of the roof, their twisted faces frozen in silent screams. The iron gates creaked faintly in a wind that did not seem strong enough to move them. Each carved figure on the walls seemed to have been placed not only as decoration but as a warning, a reminder that the lineage of those who dwelled here was steeped in power and mystery, yet haunted by secrets no outsider should witness. The path, lined with statues of forgotten ancestors, seemed to pulse with an energy that was almost tangible, as if the land itself remembered every tragedy that had unfolded over centuries. The traveler's hand hesitated at the threshold, brushing over the cold, damp stone of the archway. Inside, the air was thick, almost viscous, and carried the faint scent of old parchment, dust, and something darker, something that seemed to cling to the bones of the house itself. The grand hall was lined with portraits, their ornate frames gilded but dulled by time. As the traveler's eyes swept across them, a subtle unease took hold. The faces seemed almost alive, their gazes shifting in ways that were just perceptible enough to unsettle, an imperceptible twitch of an eye or a flicker of a shadow where none should be. The house was silent, yet there was a feeling of listening, of consciousness, as if it was waiting for an observer to step out of ignorance and into revelation. The first portrait the traveler noticed was of a stern man in formal attire, his eyes dark and penetrating. There was nothing immediately unusual, yet a sense of recognition struck, a feeling that he had somehow moved, that his expression had sharpened slightly since the traveler had first glimpsed him in a faded photograph that accompanied an old family record. The air grew colder, almost icy, a chill that reached deep into the bones. Faintly, in the distance, a sound of shifting floorboards suggested another presence, though no one appeared. The traveler's pulse quickened, awareness sharpening, senses stretched taut. Every creak, every shadowed corner seemed pregnant with expectation, and the portraits felt like witnesses, silent observers of long-forgotten rites and whispered tragedies. The narrative of the house unfolded slowly through its artifacts. Dusty furniture, carved in elaborate patterns, bore the patina of centuries of use and neglect. Cobwebs clung to chandeliers that had not been lit in decades. The walls, thick and cold, absorbed sound, leaving footsteps hollow and echoing unnaturally. The atmosphere suggested a residence that had not been abandoned completely, yet no living soul seemed to inhabit it openly. The traveler felt the weight of history pressing down, a palpable reminder that the manor's story was not merely of stone and wood but of lives, of grief and sudden absence. Each step deeper into the manor brought a sense of temporal dislocation. The grand staircase twisted upward like a spiral into uncertainty, and with every landing, the portraits multiplied, the faces seeming to watch, to follow, their subtle changes almost imperceptible but undeniably there. The traveler could almost feel the gaze of the deceased, not hostile but intensely present, as if the very act of being witnessed mattered beyond comprehension. There was a strange rhythm to the house, moments of oppressive stillness broken by faint noises, a sigh, the distant drip of water, the whisper of fabric against wood, sounds that suggested life and yet were impossible to place. In a corner, a portrait of a young woman drew particular attention. Her expression was serene, yet the traveler was certain that her eyes had shifted slightly when first approached. A subtle tightening of the lips, a shadow behind the pupils, something that made the viewer pause and question perception itself. There was no rational explanation, and yet the certainty was undeniable. The house seemed to breathe around the traveler, each room a chamber of memory, of grief, of repeated tragedy. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floors and walls, as if the house itself was elongating to contain the past and force the present to confront it. By the time the traveler reached the heart of the manor, the oppressive aura had thickened into an almost tangible presence. The portraits lined the walls in ever denser succession, faces that seemed to morph subtly when unobserved directly. The traveler understood instinctively that this house was not merely haunted in a conventional sense but that it carried an unnatural connection to mortality itself, that every life lost within its walls had left a mark not only on memory but upon the very image of the departed. The traveler's unease deepened into something that was part fear, part awe, and part sorrow. The house demanded recognition, a witness to the incomprehensible, and in that acknowledgement, the story of the manor would begin to unfold. The manor had not always been a place of dread and whispered terror. Centuries ago, it was built with the ambition and pride of a wealthy family determined to leave an indelible mark on the region. The founding patriarch, a man of considerable influence and ambition, chose the location with careful consideration, elevated above the town, surrounded by dense woodland, with a river curving below like a silver ribbon. From its inception, the manor was designed to impress, to dominate, and to endure. Stone walls rose high, adorned with intricate carvings of flora and fauna, symbolic representations of prosperity, power, and the family's belief in their own permanence. Windows were tall and narrow, framed by elaborate moldings, capturing light at certain angles to illuminate the halls in a shifting, ethereal glow. Even in its earliest days, there was a sense that this place was different, a deliberate blending of beauty, isolation, and an unspoken tension that would linger through the ages. The family itself was both admired and feared. They were patrons of the arts and champions of civic projects, yet tales of cruelty and strict discipline circulated among townsfolk. The patriarch was known for his meticulous attention to detail, demanding absolute order within the household and unbending adherence to rules. The children, while raised in luxury, were subject to a regimen that mixed education with fear, their every action scrutinized and recorded in ledgers and diaries that have survived to this day. It was said that even in their youth, they were unusually perceptive, prone to noticing details and changes that others would dismiss. This keen observation, perhaps, was both a gift and a curse, preparing them unknowingly for the unsettling phenomena that would later define the manor's legacy. The architecture of the estate reflected more than wealth, it reflected intention. Each room, each corridor, each chamber was constructed not just for function but as a deliberate psychological space. The main hall, where the most prominent portraits were displayed, was designed to awe and intimidate. Ceilings stretched high, frescoes painted with meticulous detail adorned the arches, and the fireplace, though grand, often seemed cold and uninviting. The corridors leading from the main hall were labyrinthine, winding through wings that housed servants' quarters, libraries, and private chambers. It was easy for a visitor to feel disoriented, to become aware that the very layout of the manor subtly influenced perception, steering thoughts and emotions without conscious awareness. There was an artful, almost deliberate layering of light and shadow, creating spaces that felt simultaneously safe and threatening. Historical documents, letters, and diaries provide glimpses of the family's day-to-day existence. The patriarch meticulously recorded significant events, but even routine matters were chronicled with a peculiar attention to emotional nuance. Guests often commented on the unsettling precision of these records, noting that the family seemed intensely aware of subtleties most people overlooked. Even minor changes in a portrait, a fleeting glance, a slight adjustment of expression, were observed and remembered. It is from these accounts that the earliest hints of the manor's uncanny influence emerge. There is mention of visitors remarking that certain portraits appeared different upon repeated observation, though these claims were dismissed at the time as illusions or the tricks of tired eyes. Such anecdotes, however, suggest that the phenomenon that would later define the house may have been present almost from its inception. The surrounding town played an ambiguous role in the manor's history. Initially, the family was a source of pride, their philanthropy improving infrastructure, funding schools, and establishing markets. Yet whispers of unease began almost immediately. Servants returning from the manor would speak in hushed tones of strict rules, strange silences, and the palpable weight of expectation that hung in the air like a fog. Townspeople noted that children born into the household were unusually withdrawn, as though sensing forces beyond ordinary comprehension. Legends of secret rituals or hidden chambers circulated, fueled by fear and imagination. While outwardly the family maintained respectability, these subtle signs indicated that the manor's influence extended beyond its walls, touching the lives of those who lived and worked nearby, leaving traces of unease in the broader community. The family portraits, commissioned to commemorate generations of lineage, were central to the manor's identity. Each portrait was crafted with exacting precision, capturing not only likeness but perceived character traits, social standing, and even subtle hints of temperament. Over time, these portraits became a silent record of the family's legacy, their faces frozen in moments intended to convey permanence and dignity. Yet, as later observers would note, there were discrepancies in these images even before any known deaths had occurred. Some accounts describe visitors feeling that a portrait's expression had changed subtly overnight, or that the eyes seemed to follow them with an uncanny awareness. Though these early incidents were sparse and easily dismissed, they formed the foundation for understanding the pattern that would later dominate the manor's history. The social dynamics within the household were complex and fraught with tension. Servants occupied a dual role as caretakers and unwitting witnesses to events that would confound explanation. Their proximity to the family granted them access to private spaces, yet they were strictly forbidden from speaking freely about what they observed. Letters and diaries from long-serving staff reveal an undercurrent of fear and superstition, hints of unease at the changing expressions in the portraits and a creeping awareness that the house was more than it seemed. The children of the family were both fascinated and terrified by the portraits, often engaging in whispered conversations about whether the images reflected mood, behavior, or something more sinister. This interaction between observer and observed would become increasingly significant as the manor's history unfolded. Religious influence in the town further complicated the narrative. Clergy were often called to provide guidance, blessings, or interpretations of unusual occurrences within the manor. Some members of the clergy reported feelings of dread or unease upon entering the estate, describing sensations of oppressive sorrow or a heavy weight that seemed to press upon the spirit. Attempts to offer spiritual reassurance were met with mixed results, further deepening the mystery. This intersection of faith and fear reinforced the duality of the manor's presence, simultaneously a house of prominence, education, and refinement, and a locus of phenomena that defied simple explanation. The tension between rationality and belief, science and superstition, would become a recurring theme in the family's story. Despite these early indications, life within the manor followed a carefully maintained rhythm. Meals were served punctually, education proceeded under strict supervision, and social visits reinforced the family's status and decorum. Yet, beneath this veneer of normality, there was an undercurrent of observation, of an awareness that life and death left traces beyond the immediate, tangible world. Small discrepancies in portraits, fleeting emotional expressions captured in oils, and moments of inexplicable recognition all hinted at a reality that would later be impossible to ignore. The manor existed as both home and enigma, a place where history, memory, and the inexplicable were inextricably entwined. As decades passed, the pattern of subtle anomalies began to increase in frequency. Deaths, initially rare and almost always socially noted with mourning rituals, coincided with reports of shifting expressions in portraits. Letters recounting these observations grew more frequent, with family members noting changes in posture, gaze, and facial tension in images that had previously been static. What had once been easily dismissed as imagination or fatigue became impossible to ignore. Scholars visiting the estate centuries later would reference these accounts as the earliest evidence of the manor's defining phenomena, establishing the historical groundwork for the chilling narrative that would dominate the estate's legacy. By the time the manor had reached the late 18th century, its reputation had begun to solidify as a place of fascination and subtle fear. The architectural splendor remained, the social prominence endured, and yet the weight of history pressed down on every stone and timber. Visitors sensed it, residents lived it, and even the surrounding town could not ignore the intangible influence that radiated from the house. It was no longer merely a home but a vessel of memory, grief, and an unexplainable connection between life and the permanence of representation. The stage was set for the events that would follow, events that would transform the manor from a symbol of status into a locus of macabre intrigue that haunted every observer, every descendant, and every visitor for generations to come. The first signs of the manor's unusual behavior were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they carried a weight that could not be ignored once noticed. Staff members and family alike began reporting small discrepancies in the portraits that lined the halls. At first, these observations were dismissed as tricks of the light, fatigue, or the natural aging of paint and canvas. A smile that had seemed faint the day before might appear sharper the next, a tilt of the head, a shadow behind the eyes that had not been there previously. These changes were never dramatic, but they were consistent enough to be recognized repeatedly by different observers. The subtlety of these anomalies made them all the more unnerving, for they suggested an intelligence, or responsiveness, beyond what any rational explanation could account for. Children of the family were often the first to notice these shifts. Their perception was untainted by the social constraints and disbelief that shaped adult interpretation. They would pause mid-play to point at a portrait and insist, with wide-eyed certainty, that, "She is looking at me differently today," or, "He seems sad now, but he wasn't yesterday." Adults attempted to rationalize these claims, attributing them to imagination or overactive sensitivity. Yet even the most skeptical servants found themselves glancing repeatedly at certain faces, feeling an inexplicable sense of discomfort, as if the subjects within the frames were aware of the passage of time and the lives unfolding around them. These anomalies did not occur in isolation. They were accompanied by an array of subtle environmental cues that reinforced the sense that the house itself was alive with memory. A sudden chill in a warm room, a faint whisper in the silence of the upper corridors, the feeling of being observed even when alone, all combined to heighten unease. The manor's layout, with its twisting corridors and high-ceilinged rooms, amplified these sensations. Shadows stretched unnaturally, corners seemed to shift when peripheral vision caught them, and reflections in polished surfaces sometimes displayed images that did not correspond to reality. These phenomena were not violent or overtly threatening, but their cumulative effect was psychologically profound, creating an atmosphere where the boundaries between perception and reality blurred. The earliest recorded deaths that coincided with changes in the portraits were minor, almost inconsequential in the grand historical record, yet they left a mark on those who witnessed them. A visiting relative falling ill, a servant passing quietly in their sleep, each death, though ordinary in cause, was followed by a subtle alteration in the corresponding image. Eyes seemed to glimmer with sorrow or suspicion, mouths curved into expressions that mirrored the emotions felt in the house at the time of loss. Observers could not determine whether the portraits were reflecting the deceased's personality, the grief of the living, or something far more inexplicable. These first events established a pattern that would, over generations, define the manor's eerie reputation. Tension within the household grew gradually. The family, though outwardly composed, began to exhibit signs of anxiety and hypervigilance. Children hesitated to enter certain rooms, servants avoided corridors where portraits seemed particularly responsive, and even casual conversations were tinged with unease. Journals from the period detail an almost obsessive attention to the portraits, careful observation, notes on expression, attempts to document minute changes over time. Some family members believed that the portraits were communicating a form of warning or prescience, while others feared they were conduits for grief, recording emotional energy that could not be fully understood. This growing psychological strain served to reinforce the house's influence, creating a feedback loop where attention heightened perception, perception intensified fear, and fear influenced behavior. Visitors who entered the manor during this period often left with a sense of unease that they could not articulate. Scholars, clergy, and distant relatives reported sensations of being watched, inexplicable shifts in temperature, and fleeting glimpses of movement in the corners of their vision. Many dismissed these experiences as imagination or nervousness, yet detailed accounts reveal remarkable consistency in the descriptions. Eyes in portraits were described as following movements, subtle changes in expression were noted repeatedly, and a pervasive feeling of the past pressing into the present was often emphasized. These reports contributed to the manor's growing mystique, establishing it as a place where observation itself became part of the experience, where the act of seeing and being seen was inextricably linked. Folklore and superstition began to intermingle with documented history. Stories of the manor circulated in a nearby town, a tale of a servant who swore that a portrait had nodded in acknowledgement of his loyalty, of a child who claimed that a painted figure smiled upon hearing a secret. Religious interpretations emerged alongside secular attempts at explanation. Priests were called to bless rooms, to perform rites intended to ward off spirits, yet even their presence seemed insufficient to quell the anomalies. Some began to theorize that the house was cursed, while others proposed that it was a site of divine or supernatural attention, a place where the boundary between the material and spiritual realms was thin. These conflicting interpretations created an atmosphere of both fear and fascination, embedding the manor deeper into the collective consciousness of the region. The family itself became increasingly divided in response to these phenomena. Some members attempted to impose rational explanations, seeking out physicians, alchemists, and early scientists to investigate. They documented changes meticulously, attempting to correlate deaths, illnesses, and other events with alterations in the portraits. Others abandoned rationality, succumbing to superstition, ritual, and obsessive observation. Family disputes arose over how to address the situation, with some advocating for concealment, while others insisted on public acknowledgement. These internal conflicts heightened tension and distrust, magnifying the psychological impact of the portraits and reinforcing the idea that the house exerted influence not only over perception but over relationships, loyalty, and emotional stability. The physical environment of the manor seemed to respond to this escalation. Rooms that had once felt spacious and open began to feel confining, hallways stretched longer than memory suggested, and windows often framed shadows that moved independently of natural light. Environmental cues worked in concert with the psychological state of the household. The more the family feared and observed, the more the manor appeared to participate in that fear, subtly altering spatial perception, sound, and even scent. The interplay between mind and environment created a sense of inescapable immersion, where every decision, every glance, every footstep carried potential significance in the unfolding narrative. Attempts to document the phenomenon systematically revealed further complexity. Diaries, letters, and notebooks from this period demonstrate extraordinary attention to detail, with measurements of posture, gaze, and facial expression recorded meticulously. Observers noted that the portraits seemed to anticipate changes in the household, reflecting emotion and tension even before events fully unfolded. Some accounts describe the portraits conveying mood shifts within minutes of significant interactions, others claim that images altered in response to absence or isolation, suggesting a form of perceptual feedback that defied conventional understanding. These records, while fragmented, reveal a pattern of consistency that could not easily be explained away as coincidence, illusion, or simple aging of materials. By the end of this period, the manor had acquired a reputation that extended well beyond the immediate family. Word of altered portraits and inexplicable phenomena spread quietly among the upper classes, whispered in salons and discussed in private correspondence. The house became a locus of intrigue, simultaneously admired for its architectural grandeur and approached with caution for its peculiarities. Scholars, curious observers, and those drawn to the uncanny began to reference the manor in broader accounts of regional folklore and macabre history. It was increasingly clear that the early anomalies were not isolated incidents but part of a recurring, generational pattern that linked mortality, memory, and the uncanny in ways that would define the estate for centuries. The early signs and anomalies thus served as the foundation for the manor's enduring legend. They were the first threads in a tapestry of mystery, threads that intertwined grief, perception, and inexplicable change. From the faint movements of a painted eye to the subtle curve of a mouth, the manor began to assert itself as an entity in its own right, shaping not only the experiences of those who dwelled within but the collective imagination of all who encountered it. The slow accumulation of these anomalies created a psychological and historical footprint that would resonate through generations, ensuring that every subsequent death, every emotional upheaval, and every observer would participate in a narrative that was at once intimate, terrifying, and impossible to fully comprehend. The first witnesses to the manor's unsettling phenomena were often those who occupied the space closest to its daily rhythms. Servants, tutors, and distant relatives who stayed for extended periods began to notice things that could not be easily dismissed. A chambermaid reported that one morning, a portrait of the matriarch appeared to be frowning more deeply than it had the night before, though the frame itself had not been moved. A tutor described a slight change in the gaze of a young girl painted decades earlier, her eyes appearing to follow his movements with an uncanny awareness. These early observations were met with skepticism by the family's senior members, who attributed them to fatigue, imagination, or the play of light on old oil paint. Yet the persistence of multiple independent accounts suggested a pattern that was impossible to ignore. As more people bore witness, the accounts began to grow in detail and in their unnerving nature. Servants spoke of whispers in empty rooms, fleeting shadows glimpsed from the corner of the eye, and the sensation of being watched even in private quarters. These descriptions, while subtle, created a pervasive sense of unease. Some servants refused to enter certain halls altogether, citing a feeling of dread that clung to the very walls. The youngest family members, whose perceptions were often sharper and less constrained by logic, were the first to articulate what others could only sense, that the portraits themselves seemed responsive, aware, and capable of conveying emotion in a way that transcended paint and canvas. The family's reactions to these testimonies varied. Some dismissed the reports, insisting that the house was merely old and prone to optical illusions or that the mind, under stress, could conjure perceived movement where none existed. Others, however, grew increasingly anxious, documenting each change with meticulous attention. Observations were recorded in journals and ledgers, the position of eyes, the tilt of a head, the subtle curve of lips, all noted and compared over days and weeks. It became clear to those keeping such records that there was a consistency to the changes, suggesting that they were not random or accidental. The portraits did not simply change, they changed in correlation with events, moods, and, most chillingly, deaths within the household. Community perception began to shift as whispers of the manor's oddities reached beyond its walls. Neighbors and visiting scholars expressed curiosity mixed with apprehension. A local historian recounted visiting the manor to study its architecture, only to be struck by the intensity of the portrait's gaze. Clergy were summoned for blessings and prayers, yet many left the estate unsettled, reporting feelings of a presence that was neither wholly malignant nor benign. The broader public, hearing these reports secondhand, began to weave the manor into local folklore. Tales of curses, spiritual disturbances, and supernatural observations circulated quietly in the village and surrounding towns, casting the family in a dual light, both respected and feared, admired for wealth and status, yet whispered about in cautionary tones. As reports accumulated, so did internal tension. The household began to fracture along lines of belief and skepticism. Some family members sought rational explanations, consulting physicians, natural philosophers, and scholars to determine if there might be a medical or environmental cause for the disturbances. Others turned to superstition, performing private rites, prayers, and symbolic gestures to appease whatever unseen force seemed to influence the portraits. The resulting atmosphere was one of quiet suspicion. No one could fully trust their own perceptions, let alone those of others. Disputes arose over interpretation, the appropriate response, and whether to reveal or conceal the anomalies from outsiders. The nature of the changes themselves grew more pronounced over time. Initially minor alterations, the faint lift of a brow, the slight glint in an eye, began to extend to more expressive transformations. Portraits of deceased relatives seemed to mirror the grief or anger of the living. Observers noted that subtle shifts in mood or circumstance within the household could provoke corresponding changes in the imagery. A joyous event might lighten the expression of a figure, while an argument or injury could darken it. This phenomenon introduced a psychological complexity that compounded fear with fascination, as observers could not separate objective reality from the influence the house exerted over perception. Early attempts to record and explain these events were methodical yet increasingly desperate. Diaries, ledgers, and sketches were created to track every known change, yet they rarely offered conclusive evidence. In some instances, witnesses attempted to isolate a portrait, covering it or relocating it to a different room to determine whether the house itself or the painting was responsible. Even when these measures were taken, changes persisted. Observers began to speculate that the portraits were not simply passive objects but active participants in the life of the household, reflecting a hidden truth that no living person could fully decipher. The interplay between witness and phenomenon created a feedback loop. The more attention a portrait received, the more pronounced its changes seemed to become. Servants and family members found themselves caught between fear and fascination, unable to resist studying the faces that shifted subtly before their eyes. Sleep deprivation, heightened anxiety, and obsessive attention to detail intensified the household's collective sense of dread. Visitors noted an oppressive atmosphere, describing it as a tangible presence that weighed on the spirit and distorted perception. The manor's influence was no longer confined to individual experience, it permeated the social and psychological fabric of the household. Religious and moral interpretations intersected with these observations. Clergy attempted to frame the phenomena as divine messages, omens, or tests of character. Rituals were conducted in private, and prayers were offered before portraits during times of crisis. While some family members derived comfort from these practices, others interpreted the results as further evidence of inexplicable forces beyond human control. These conflicting interpretations only heightened tension, leaving the family divided and reinforcing the sense that the manor itself dictated its own rules and demanded a form of recognition that transcended human understanding. The broader social network of witnesses extended over decades. Visiting relatives, scholars, and town officials documented subtle changes with varying degrees of skepticism and credulity. Accounts were often corroborated, suggesting that the phenomena were not products of imagination alone. The manor became an axis of observation, where human perception, emotional response, and environmental subtlety intertwined to create a haunting tableau. Each testimony, each diary entry, contributed to a layered narrative in which the portraits were both record and agent, passive yet deeply intertwined with the household's fate. Through these early witnesses, the manor's mystery gained definition and complexity. The accumulation of testimonies, observations, and reactions revealed a consistent pattern, that life and death, emotion and memory, were somehow encoded within the very images that lined the halls. The presence of these witnesses served not merely as corroboration but as an active component in the unfolding enigma. Their experiences demonstrate that the manor was not simply a place of residence but a living archive of human experience, one that responded to, reflected, and perhaps even manipulated the perception of those who dwelled within and around it. By the end of this period, the manor had established a reputation both in its immediate vicinity and in broader historical accounts as a locus of the uncanny. The experiences of early witnesses provided tangible grounding for the phenomenon, bridging rumor, observation, and documented experience. Their testimonies, infused with fear, doubt, and awe, set the stage for the escalation of events that would follow. The manor, through the eyes of those who lived and worked within it, became a character in its own right, enigmatic, observant, and impossibly alive, its portraits the silent yet expressive chroniclers of a history steeped in grief, change, and mystery. The first tragedy that truly marked the manor with an inescapable sense of dread occurred on a cold, gray morning, when the household awoke to the news of the sudden death of the eldest son. Though the cause was ordinary, an illness that modern medicine would easily explain, the timing and the circumstances surrounding it seemed almost orchestrated by fate. As the family gathered to mourn, the portraits lining the main hall appeared to respond to the event in subtle, yet unmistakable ways. Observers noticed that the son's portrait, previously static and composed, now held a sorrowful expression, his eyes appearing darker and heavier with grief. At the same time, portraits of other family members seemed to reflect tension, despair, and confusion, as though the images themselves were participating in the mourning. The household, already tense from previous anomalies, was thrown into deeper disquiet, as fear and suspicion took hold alongside sorrow. The funeral arrangements, though conducted with customary decorum, were permeated by a sense of unease. Servants whispered in corners, recounting small changes in portraits they had noticed upon entering the hall that morning. A faint shadow behind the eyes of the mother's painting seemed almost to glimmer in acknowledgement of the tragedy. Children in the household were visibly disturbed, some refusing to approach the main hall, others staring at portraits for hours, attempting to understand the shifting expressions they observed. The event marked a turning point in the household's collective consciousness, as the family could no longer ignore the increasingly obvious connection between death and the transformations captured in the painted faces. In the days that followed, the family attempted to rationalize the changes. Physicians were consulted to confirm that there was no illness or malady that could affect perception or eyesight. Artists and painters were brought to examine the works, but no cracks, alterations, or tampering could account for the shifting expressions. The servants, already uneasy, were instructed to record observations meticulously, noting the positions of eyes, tilt of heads, and any subtle modifications in expression. Yet the more they documented, the more apparent it became that these changes were not products of material decay or subjective error. There was a pattern that corresponded too precisely with the emotional and physical events of the household. Fear, grief, and anxiety seemed to feed into the portraits themselves, creating a feedback loop that left both witnesses and participants unsettled and increasingly powerless. The family's response to the tragedy was divided. Some insisted on removing the portraits from view, covering them with cloths and relocating them to storage rooms. Others believed that the portraits were sacred records, vessels that held both memory and warning, and argued against tampering. This tension intensified the psychological strain within the household. Members found themselves scrutinizing each other's reactions, interpreting subtle gestures, glances, and murmurs as signs of belief or skepticism. The atmosphere became charged with suspicion, as grief was compounded by a growing awareness that the house itself seemed alive with knowledge and memory. Even ordinary interactions carried an undertone of caution, as each individual feared the potential implications of thoughtless behavior or overlooked detail. Beyond the immediate household, whispers began to spread among the town and visiting acquaintances. The death of the eldest son, though not unusual in cause, coincided so precisely with observable changes in the portraits that rumors of supernatural influence began to circulate more persistently. A visiting relative noted the eeriness of the main hall, describing the portraits as watching in silent accusation and shifting in their grief to mirror ours. Clergy and local scholars were consulted, some suggesting spiritual possession or divine attention, others attributing the phenomena to the moral weight of the family's history. The duality of explanation, rational versus supernatural, became a recurring theme in the Manor's unfolding story, framing the tragedy within a complex web of perception, emotion, and speculation. In the private quarters, the psychological impact deepened. Family members reported restless sleep, recurring dreams, and the sensation that the house itself was moving subtly around them. The portrait's gaze seemed to follow even in peripheral vision, and their expressions appeared to shift according to the observer's emotional state. Children described conversations with the painted figures, asserting that their eyes knew what had happened and reflected what they felt. Adults, though skeptical at first, began to experience inexplicable unease, acknowledging moments when shadows and light seemed to transform the images, and when subtle movements contradicted physical reality. The manor, once a symbol of stability and tradition, was now a dynamic psychological presence, capable of influencing perception, behavior, and emotional state. Attempts to seek rational explanations expanded into early scientific inquiry. Physicians documented visual perception, light sources, and air quality. Artists examined pigment, brushwork, and framing, searching for evidence of deliberate manipulation. Yet every investigation failed to account for the precise correlations between deaths and changes in the portraits. The anomalies persisted regardless of lighting, distance, or observation method. Some theorized that the house itself contained properties that could alter perception, or that the human mind was particularly susceptible to suggestion within its walls. Others speculated that the portraits absorbed and reflected the emotional energy of those within the household. The failure of these attempts only served to heighten fear, creating a sense that the manor and its images were beyond ordinary comprehension. Social interactions within the household were transformed by this first tragedy. Family members became hyper-aware of one another, reading expressions, monitoring glances, and interpreting subtle behaviors with heightened sensitivity. Servants were similarly affected, often experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and avoidance of certain areas. The manor's influence extended beyond the visual, as emotional resonance permeated every interaction. The portraits acted as silent narrators of grief, responding to tension, joy, or sorrow, and reinforcing the cyclical pattern in which human emotion and the house's enigmatic presence were intertwined. In effect, the tragedy had elevated the manor from a residence into a psychological ecosystem, where every observer became a participant in an ongoing, reactive drama. The external perception of the tragedy amplified its effect. Townspeople and visiting acquaintances began to describe the manor in increasingly ominous terms. Letters written to distant family members recounted eerie experiences and subtle anomalies that could not be explained. The death of the eldest son was cited as evidence of a pattern, a convergence of mortality and expression, and soon became part of local folklore. The manor was no longer simply a home of a wealthy family but a locus of uncanny influence, a place where life and death, perception and emotion, intersected in ways that challenged conventional understanding. Within the household, attempts to restore normalcy were futile. Daily routines continued, yet they were undercut by a pervasive tension. Meals were silent, conversations measured, and movement through the corridors cautious. The portraits served as constant reminders of loss and the impossibility of ignoring the patterns established by tragedy. Children, in particular, internalized fear and uncertainty, often speaking of private encounters with the painted figures and expressing dread that the house itself was conscious of their thoughts and actions. Adults, caught between grief, rational skepticism, and the undeniable evidence of change, experienced stress, insomnia, and hypervigilance. The manor had become a crucible of emotion, reflection, and psychic tension. The first tragedy, therefore, marked a definitive shift in the manor's history. It transformed subtle anomalies into undeniable reality, altering the household's psychological landscape and creating a precedent that would influence generations. From that point onward, each death, each alteration, and each observation carried heightened significance. The portraits, once passive commemorations of family legacy, now functioned as active participants in an ongoing narrative, reflecting emotion, recording grief, and marking the passage of life in a way that was at once intimate, horrifying, and profoundly compelling. The interplay of mortality, memory, and observation became the defining characteristic of the estate, establishing the pattern that would haunt every subsequent chapter in the manor's dark history. The manor's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day, as though the house itself absorbed grief and fear and exhaled it back into the rooms. Following the first undeniable tragedy, the household became increasingly tense, every sound amplified and every shadow scrutinized. Servants moved cautiously through the halls, their eyes darting toward the portraits lining the walls. Even those previously skeptical found themselves pausing before each frame, sensing an almost imperceptible change in expression that corresponded eerily with the emotions in the house. What had once been subtle, fleeting observations were now persistent and unavoidable, creating a psychological strain that settled over the family like a second skin. Children, already sensitive to the manor's uncanny influence, began exhibiting behaviors that reflected the growing tension. Some refused to enter certain rooms, clinging instead to areas where the portraits felt quiet or friendly. Others spoke in hushed tones to the images themselves, describing private conversations as if the painted figures could respond. Adults struggled to maintain composure, attempting to reassure themselves and each other that these perceptions were products of stress or imagination. Yet the more they observed, the more impossible it became to deny the connection between emotion, mortality, and the subtle changes in the artwork. Fear, grief, and obsession became intertwined with the very identity of the household. As deaths accumulated over subsequent months and years, the manor's psychological weight intensified. Each loss was accompanied by a corresponding transformation in the portraits, leaving observers both fascinated and horrified. Family members began to monitor each other obsessively, scrutinizing behavior for signs of emotional fluctuation or hidden despair. Servants kept meticulous records of every alteration, noting eye movement, lip curves, posture, and shadow, in the hope of detecting patterns. Yet the phenomenon defied consistent explanation, shifting unpredictably yet always in concert with events in the household. The manor seemed to operate according to its own logic, responsive not to reason but to the rhythms of life and death within its walls. Attempts to maintain routine proved increasingly futile. Daily meals, lessons, and household chores became exercises in tension management. Family members avoided eye contact in the presence of certain portraits, fearful that even the smallest gesture could provoke a reaction. The servants, too, felt the strain, some resigning themselves to constant anxiety, others refusing to approach specific corridors. Nights were particularly oppressive, as shadows elongated unnaturally, drafts whispered through empty rooms, and faint noises, footsteps, sighs, or the soft creak of timber, echoed in uninhabited spaces. Sleep deprivation became widespread, exacerbating paranoia and amplifying the perceived responsiveness of the portraits. The house was no longer a backdrop for life, it had become an active participant in the emotional and psychological landscape of its inhabitants. The emotional strain manifested in conflict. Family members grew irritable, mistrustful, and prone to accusation. Disagreements over whether to conceal or document the anomalies became frequent, with some insisting on secrecy while others argued for recording and observation. Each perspective was laden with fear. Secrecy could invite further malevolent influence, while open documentation risked exposing the household to ridicule or judgment from outsiders. These divisions reinforced the manor's oppressive presence, as interpersonal tension fed the cycle of observation and response, further entrenching the family in a state of anxiety and hyper-awareness. Visitors, though rare, were affected immediately upon entering the manor. Scholars, distant relatives, and occasional clergy reported feeling an almost physical weight pressing upon them, a sense of observation that extended beyond mere walls or decoration. Eyes in the portraits were described as tracking movement, expressions shifting subtly to mirror tension or curiosity. The phenomenon was not universally alarming, some described fascination or awe, but the underlying unease was undeniable. Even those prepared to dismiss the occurrences as coincidence could not ignore the consistency of the observations, or the way the environment itself seemed to amplify attention and emotion. As months turned into years, the family's mental state began to deteriorate in ways that were both subtle and profound. Obsessive behaviors emerged, constant monitoring of portraits, repeated comparisons of past and present expressions, and compulsive documentation of events. Emotional stability eroded under the constant presence of the manor's influence, and relationships strained under the weight of suspicion and fear. Ordinary interactions carried layers of tension, as every gesture, tone, or glance could be interpreted as contributing to the dynamic interplay between living observers and painted figures. The house was no longer merely a residence, it had become a psychological ecosystem, a crucible of emotion and perception in which every inhabitant was both subject and participant. Attempts at rational explanation continued but with diminishing effect. Physicians and scholars could not account for the precise correlation between deaths, emotional states, and changes in portraits. Artistic examinations revealed no evidence of tampering or material degradation sufficient to explain the phenomenon. Some theorized that the house itself exerted influence over perception, while others posited that the portraits absorbed and reflected the emotional energy of the inhabitants. Religious interpretation persisted, with occasional blessings, rituals, and prayers offered, but even these failed to alter the fundamental pattern. The manor operated according to rules that were beyond ordinary understanding, and the household became increasingly aware of its own helplessness in the face of these inexplicable forces. The pervasive atmosphere of dread and hypervigilance also began to affect physical health. Stress-induced illness, insomnia, and nervous exhaustion became common among both family and staff. Servants reported recurring nightmares and heightened sensitivity to sounds and light. Children became prone to anxiety attacks and extreme caution in movement, fearing unseen observation or the subtle consequences of their actions. Even casual activities, such as walking through a hallway or sitting in the drawing room, were fraught with a quiet tension, as though every moment carried potential significance in the ongoing interaction between life, emotion, and portrait. By this stage, the manor had evolved into a self-sustaining cycle of psychological influence. Each new death heightened vigilance and fear, which in turn appeared to trigger further subtle alterations in the portraits. The emotional feedback loop intensified the household's isolation, as family members withdrew from one another and from the outside world. Every interaction, every glance at a portrait, every movement within the corridors reinforced the sense that the house was both aware and responsive. The once grand estate, celebrated for its architecture and lineage, had become a living archive of grief, observation, and incomprehensible connection between mortality and representation. The long-term psychological impact was profound. Family members, servants, and occasional visitors carried the influence of the manor long after leaving its halls. Anxiety, obsession, and a heightened sensitivity to subtle changes in expression persisted, reinforcing the notion that the manor's influence was not confined to its physical space but extended into the mind and memory of all who had witnessed it. The house had become a character in its own right, an active participant in the lives of its inhabitants, shaping their emotions, perceptions, and ultimately, their fate. The escalation of the manor's influence became impossible to ignore as the household entered a period of heightened anxiety and dread. By this point, the portraits no longer merely shifted subtly with events, they seemed to anticipate them. Observers reported changes in expression before notable occurrences, as if the painted figures were aware of grief or tension before it unfolded in the living. This anticipation created a sense of inevitability within the family. Each moment was fraught with the knowledge that the house itself, through its portraits, could reflect and even manipulate perception, leaving inhabitants feeling both watched and powerless. Daily life in the manor became increasingly regimented, with family members and servants carefully documenting every subtle alteration. Ledgers and journals were filled with observations on eye movement, posture, and facial expression, alongside the timing of events such as illness, disputes, or emotional outbursts. Even minor occurrences were scrutinized, as if the act of attention itself could either provoke or predict change. The constant vigilance became exhausting, feeding a cycle of stress and hyper-awareness that intensified the perceived responsiveness of the portraits. Every glance carried meaning, every shadow seemed purposeful, and the manor transformed into a psychological labyrinth where observation was both necessary and terrifying. Attempts to rationalize these phenomena grew more desperate. Physicians examined the family for signs of hysteria or neurological disorder, while artists and scholars studied the paintings for evidence of alteration or trickery. Yet every investigation failed to account for the precise correlation between emotional states, deaths, and visual changes. Some proposed that the portraits absorbed and reflected the emotional energy of the living, while others believed that the house itself possessed a form of consciousness or latent memory. These interpretations, though speculative, underscored the growing recognition that the manor's influence extended beyond mere superstition. It was a force that shaped perception, behavior, and even relationships within the household. The psychological strain also affected social interactions. Family members became increasingly suspicious of one another, reading gestures, tones, and glances for hidden meaning. Servants, too, were impacted, sometimes refusing to enter certain rooms or corridors, while others obsessively monitored every shift in expression. Children, sensitive to subtle cues, internalized fear and confusion, often speaking of private encounters with the portraits or expressing dread at the anticipation of future events. The manor's presence was no longer a backdrop, it had become a pervasive force, shaping not only perception but the dynamics of trust, loyalty, and emotional response. Religious and moral interpretations continued to intersect with observation. Clergy were consulted for blessings and guidance, offering prayers and rituals intended to protect or influence the household. Yet even these interventions seemed insufficient, and many practitioners left the manor unsettled, describing a palpable weight or oppressive energy that defied explanation. The tension between faith, rational inquiry, and lived experience became a defining feature of the household, highlighting the duality of human perception when confronted with phenomena that straddled the boundary between the natural and the inexplicable. As the pattern of anticipation and change became more pronounced, the family began to isolate itself further. Guests were rare, and communication with the outside world was limited to necessary correspondence. The household's collective consciousness focused increasingly on monitoring the portraits and the interactions between life, death, and representation. Every new death, illness, or emotional upheaval was carefully noted, and observers sought to detect subtle premonitions in the portrait's expressions. This intense focus reinforced the manor's psychological grip, creating a feedback loop in which attention fueled responsiveness, and responsiveness deepened attention, leaving the household trapped within its own observation. The portraits themselves assumed a new role in the household's perception. They were no longer simply records of lineage or memory, they became active participants in the emotional landscape. Observers described eyes that seemed to follow more intently, lips that hinted at expression before emotion was consciously felt, and postures that subtly mirrored the moods and tensions of the living. The relationship between observer and observed was reciprocal, with the house mediating experience in a way that blurred the boundary between reality and perception. It was as if the manor had evolved into a living archive, preserving and responding to the emotional life of its inhabitants in real time. By this stage, the escalation of phenomena had reached a point where rational explanation was almost irrelevant. Documentation and observation, while meticulous, provided only partial understanding. The manor's influence had become a constant, shaping the daily existence of all within its walls. The portraits, and the subtle changes they underwent, were now central to the household's experience of reality, mediating grief, anxiety, and anticipation. Life inside the manor had transformed into a slow, relentless engagement with the uncanny, an existence in which perception, emotion, and memory were inseparable from the pervasive presence of the house itself. Isolation became the defining characteristic of the manor as the psychological weight of its phenomena intensified. Family members and servants alike withdrew into themselves, reluctant to move through certain corridors or enter rooms where portraits exhibited the most pronounced changes. Even casual interactions were imbued with tension, as every glance, gesture, or tone was scrutinized for meaning. The house had transformed from a residence into a living, reactive environment, where perception and emotion were inseparable from the shifting expressions that lined the walls. The sense of being observed was constant, creating an invisible pressure that dictated behavior and constrained freedom. Visitors became increasingly rare. Scholars, clergy, and distant relatives who once ventured into the manor for study or social obligations now hesitated, deterred by reports of the house's uncanny influence. Those who did enter often left unsettled, describing subtle but persistent alterations in the portraits, shadows that seemed to move independently, and a pervasive sensation of dread. Attempts to rationalize these experiences with scientific or religious explanations proved inadequate, and many concluded that the manor's influence could not be contained or fully understood. The isolation of the household, once voluntary, became a protective measure, shielding them from external scrutiny but intensifying the internal tension. The family's relationship suffered under the relentless psychological strain. Distrust grew as members interpreted subtle behaviors as signs of belief, skepticism, or complicity in whatever forces animated the portraits. Arguments over how to document, interpret, or conceal the anomalies became common, reinforcing the sense that the manor itself dictated the terms of interaction. Children internalized fear, often expressing it through whispered conversations with the painted figures, while adults vacillated between obsessive observation and desperate attempts to ignore the phenomena. The cycle of attention and responsiveness intensified, creating a feedback loop in which the house exerted increasing control over both perception and behavior. Attempts to escape the manor's influence proved futile. Relocation of portraits, covering them, or rearranging rooms yielded no relief, as the changes persisted regardless of intervention. Family members began to experience heightened anxiety, insomnia, and stress-related illness, their mental and physical health deteriorating under the constant psychological pressure. Servants reported recurring nightmares and heightened sensitivity to sound and light, further emphasizing that the manor's influence extended beyond the visual into the very experience of daily life. Isolation, while a defensive strategy, deepened the psychological impact, leaving inhabitants trapped in a closed ecosystem of fear and observation. The manor's physical space also contributed to this sense of isolation. Hallways seemed longer than memory suggested, corners appeared to shift subtly, and shadows stretched in ways that contradicted natural light. The architecture itself reinforced a feeling of confinement, amplifying perception and emotion in a manner that was both disorienting and compelling. The interplay between environment and psychological state created an immersive experience in which every step, every glance, and every encounter with a portrait carried significance. The house mediated life within its walls, shaping not only how events were experienced but how they were interpreted. Religious and superstitious responses became more pronounced during this period. Clergy and spiritual advisors were consulted with increasing frequency, offering prayers, blessings, and rituals intended to mitigate the influence of the portraits. While some family members derived comfort from these practices, the results were inconsistent at best, reinforcing the sense that the manor operated according to its own rules. The tension between rational thought, spiritual intervention, and lived experience underscored the complexity of the household's predicament, highlighting the difficulty of reconciling observation, belief, and fear in a space that seemed to defy conventional understanding. The household's daily life increasingly revolved around observation and anticipation. Every emotional fluctuation, disagreement, or event was measured against the responses in the portraits. Patterns were documented, analyzed, and compared, yet the phenomena remained unpredictable, responding in ways that were subtle, deliberate, and often inexplicable. This constant scrutiny intensified isolation, as inhabitants withdrew not only from the outside world but from one another, preoccupied with deciphering the language of the paintings. The manor had become both home and enigma, a space where perception, emotion, and the uncanny converged in a continuous, inescapable cycle. By the end of this period, the manor's isolation had become a defining feature of its legacy. The household existed in a state of heightened awareness and persistent unease, with every moment shaped by observation, expectation, and the ever-present influence of the portraits. External connections waned, interpersonal trust eroded, and the psychological grip of the house tightened. The estate had transformed into a self-contained world in which life, death, emotion, and perception were inextricably linked, and the legacy of isolation became both a symptom and a reinforcement of the phenomena that would haunt the manor for generations to come. The manor's escalating influence reached its most profound manifestation as the household descended into near-total psychological collapse. By this stage, the portraits were no longer subtle reflections of emotion or response, they had become active participants in the lives of the family and servants, anticipating events and seemingly interacting with the living in ways that defied explanation. Every death, illness, or argument was mirrored, sometimes amplified, in the expressions captured on canvas. Observers reported that eyes glimmered with prescience, mouths shifted to convey sorrow or reproach, and postures seemed to reflect tension before it could be consciously perceived. The house, once merely the backdrop for a family legacy, now exerted an agency that was as undeniable as it was terrifying, shaping the emotional and perceptual experience of all within its walls. Daily life was dominated by the relentless observation of the portraits. Family members and staff became consumed with documenting every minute change, recording eye movements, subtle shifts in expression, and alterations in posture. Diaries, ledgers, and sketchbooks filled with notes became indispensable tools for coping with an environment that seemed to respond to attention itself. Yet the more meticulously they recorded, the more impossible it became to maintain calm. The very act of observation heightened the responsiveness of the portraits, creating a feedback loop in which fear, grief, and anticipation fed the house's enigmatic behavior. Every gesture, every whispered conversation, even the fleeting passage of a shadow, was scrutinized for meaning, reinforcing a pervasive sense of entrapment. Children were perhaps the most affected, their innocence making them uniquely sensitive to the house's influence. Many refused to enter certain rooms, speaking in low voices to the painted figures as if expecting a response. Others became fixated on particular portraits, watching hours pass without rest, describing interactions with the images as if they were alive. Adults, though initially dismissive of these behaviors, found themselves increasingly anxious, noticing subtle movements in their own reflections, as well as the unrelenting scrutiny of painted eyes. The psychological weight of the house extended beyond simple fear, it became a suffocating presence that influenced thought, perception, and behavior at every level. The family's social isolation intensified during this period. Visitors became nearly non-existent, deterred by reports of the manor's strange influence and the palpable atmosphere of dread. Those who did enter often left unnerved, reporting eyes that seemed to follow, expressions that shifted in anticipation, and an oppressive sense of awareness emanating from every room. Attempts to rationalize these experiences proved futile, as no natural or scientific explanation could account for the precise correlations between events and portrait changes. The house's influence was both subtle and comprehensive, shaping the mental state of anyone who remained for more than a few hours. Interpersonal tensions escalated dramatically. The stress of constant observation and the unpredictable responsiveness of the portraits bred suspicion and conflict within the household. Family members interpreted subtle gestures or tones as indicators of belief or skepticism, creating an environment rife with misunderstanding and anxiety. Servants, similarly affected, were divided between fear and compulsion, some retreating from the most active areas while others obsessed over every observable detail. Children absorbed these tensions, further amplifying the emotional feedback loop. The manor, through its architecture and the animated presence of its portraits, mediated relationships, influencing trust, loyalty, and the very structure of social interaction within its walls. Attempts to mitigate the effects of the house became increasingly desperate. Portraits were covered or relocated, rituals were performed, and clergy were consulted for blessings and protection. Scientific inquiries were undertaken, with physicians examining mental and visual health and artists analyzing pigment, technique, and material degradation. Yet none of these efforts produced meaningful results. The house appeared impervious to intervention, changes persisted regardless of method, demonstrating a consistency and intelligence that rendered human efforts almost irrelevant. The manor's agency, subtle yet absolute, suggested a force operating according to its own inscrutable logic, indifferent to human reason or intervention. The psychological impact on the household reached its zenith during periods of heightened grief or crisis. Deaths, illness, or disputes triggered pronounced transformations in the portraits, often preceding the events themselves. Observers described eyes glimmering with anticipation, expressions darkening in warning, and postures reflecting tension before conscious awareness could register. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, and hypervigilance became pervasive, affecting physical health and eroding resilience. The manor had transformed from a residence into a sentient environment, one that interacted dynamically with emotion and perception, creating an inescapable cycle of observation, response, and psychological deterioration. Folklore surrounding the manor began to solidify during this period. Word of the household's peculiar circumstances spread beyond the immediate region, attracting scholars, clergy, and curious visitors despite warnings. Tales of the portraits' responsiveness, the anticipatory nature of their gaze, and the profound psychological impact on the family became part of local legend. While some dismissed the stories as exaggeration or superstition, the consistency of first-hand accounts lent credibility to the otherwise incredible claims. The house's reputation evolved into a duality, a symbol of lineage and architectural grandeur, and simultaneously a locus of fear, dread, and inexplicable influence. By this stage, the manor's history had become a testament to the destructive potential of unrelenting observation. Life inside was dictated by the interplay between the living and the painted, a cycle in which emotional expression, mortality, and perception were inseparable from the house itself. The psychological landscape was characterized by tension, anticipation, and the creeping sense of helplessness that accompanied constant scrutiny. The portraits, far from being inert decorations, had become agents of influence, reflecting and amplifying the internal states of the household while shaping the trajectory of events in subtle, profound ways. The collapse of normal life within the manor was not sudden but gradual, the culmination of decades of psychological pressure, grief, and observation. By this point, the household was defined by vigilance, fear, and isolation. Daily routines were overshadowed by the need to monitor the shifting expressions, anticipate the house's responses, and navigate a social environment charged with suspicion and tension. The estate had become both home and enigma, a living archive of emotion, memory, and mortality, where perception and reality were intertwined and every resident was caught in the ongoing influence of a force they could neither fully understand nor escape. The manor's enduring legacy became a subject of speculation and inquiry as the years passed, drawing the attention of historians, scholars, and curious observers far beyond the immediate region. Its reputation as a place where portraits shifted in response to death, emotion, and observation made it a unique study in the intersection of memory, grief, and perception. Visitors who came seeking understanding were often confronted with the same overwhelming atmosphere that had shaped the household for generations, a pervasive tension that seemed to seep from the walls themselves, a sense of being watched that extended beyond mere observation, and the unsettling awareness that the house had its own logic, one that operated independently of human reasoning. Historical records reveal that even well-educated and rational individuals struggled to reconcile what they witnessed with their understanding of art, psychology, and natural law. Scholars documented subtle changes in posture, expression, and gaze across multiple portraits, attempting to correlate these alterations with events in the household. Diaries and letters from visitors describe eyes that seemed to follow movement, lips that hinted at emotion before it was consciously felt, and an uncanny responsiveness that defied logical explanation. Even when external observers attempted to isolate variables, removing portraits from rooms, changing lighting, or limiting access, the phenomena persisted, suggesting a mechanism that was independent of ordinary cause and effect. The family's attempts to protect their home and control the narrative were increasingly futile. Attempts to conceal or cover portraits, while temporarily comforting, did little to halt the perceived alterations. Fear and fascination remained intertwined, compelling meticulous documentation and careful observation. Servants maintained detailed journals of every noticeable change, noting not only physical alterations but also emotional and psychological responses from those who lived within the manor. This obsessive recording reinforced the household's sense that the manor was not passive but actively engaged with its inhabitants, shaping perception and behavior in subtle but undeniable ways. As the manor's story spread, interpretations multiplied. Religious authorities offered theories of divine influence or spiritual punishment, while scientific minds explored possibilities ranging from optical illusion to psychological suggestion. Folklore contributed additional layers, suggesting curses, ancestral memory, or otherworldly awareness embedded in the very fabric of the house. Each explanation illuminated some facets of the phenomenon while leaving others unresolved, creating a complex tapestry of interpretation in which reason, superstition, and observation coexisted uneasily. The diversity of perspectives reinforced the manor's mystique, ensuring that it remained both feared and studied, revered and avoided. Within the household, the psychological toll was profound. Years of hypervigilance, grief, and obsessive observation had created a delicate equilibrium that required constant maintenance. Family members navigated daily life with careful attention to emotional expression, conscious of the manor's responsiveness. Servants developed rituals and routines designed to minimize disruption or provoke change in controlled ways. Children grew up in a world where every glance at a portrait carried potential meaning, where the emotional state of observers and observed intertwined in a continuous feedback loop. The manor had become a psychological crucible, shaping identity, behavior, and social interaction through its pervasive and inscrutable influence. Attempts to reconcile the phenomenon with rational explanation continued, yet each investigation highlighted the limits of human understanding. Physicians documented emotional and physiological responses but could not account for the precise correlation between events and portrait alterations. Artists and restorers confirmed the integrity of the works themselves, finding no evidence of tampering or material failure sufficient to explain the transformations. Even religious interventions provided only temporary solace, reinforcing the sense that the manor operated according to its own rules. The inescapable conclusion for many was that the estate existed on a threshold between known reality and something ineffably beyond comprehension. The manor's influence extended beyond the walls, shaping local perception and collective memory. Townspeople recounted stories of the house's uncanny responsiveness, and scholars incorporated accounts into broader discussions of macabre history and the supernatural. While some observers dismissed these narratives as exaggerated or fanciful, consistent details across multiple independent accounts lent credibility to the idea that the Manor's portraits were uniquely sensitive to human emotion and mortality. Its reputation as a locus of the uncanny ensured that the estate remained both feared and revered, a symbol of the enduring intersection between life, death, and observation. Over time, the Manor's narrative became a study not only of its supernatural elements but also of human psychology under prolonged stress and observation. The household's obsessive attention to minute changes, the cultivation of meticulous records, and the emotional intensity of prolonged exposure created an environment where perception and reality blurred. Observers and participants alike were drawn into the Manor's rhythm, experiencing shifts in cognition, awareness, and emotional resonance that reinforced the impression of an active, living presence. The portraits functioned as mirrors, amplifying internal states while simultaneously reflecting external events, creating a dynamic interplay that could neither be fully controlled nor explained. By the culmination of this period, the Manor had achieved a legendary status that transcended its physical structure. It was recognized as a site of profound psychological, historical, and cultural significance, a place where memory, grief, and perception converged into a persistent enigma. The estate had become an entity in its own right, influencing those within and around it, mediating emotional states, and shaping the very experience of life and death. Its legacy, carefully documented yet never fully understood, ensured that it would remain a subject of fascination, fear, and speculation for generations to come.